Disclaimer: it's inspired by reality, shaped by imagination.
What happens when Sir Anthony Hopkins, the Oscar-winning actor known for his sharp intellect and quiet intensity, sits across from Denise Welch, the outspoken and fiery host of Loose Women, and the topic is whether political correctness is destroying free speech in America? What unfolds isn't just a talk show debate. It's a collision of generations, values, and the meaning of truth itself. The studio started light, laughter bouncing off the walls, but the moment Denise said, "Some people mistake cruelty for honesty," Hopkins' eyes sharpened. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "And some," he replied, "mistake silence for kindness." The audience gasped. That calm but cutting delivery drew every ear closer. Denise leaned in, unwilling to yield. "But don't you think words have power to hurt?" she pressed. Hopkins nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "Yes, but censoring thought hurts far more." From there, the conversation turned electric. The audience could feel it. A man from another era defending the right to offend, a modern voice defending compassion. What began as polite exchange became a masterclass in conviction. By the end, tension filled the air so thickly that even Denise paused mid-sentence. And when Hopkins finally stood, mic in hand, and said, "Truth shouldn't need permission to exist," the crowd erupted. What followed left the entire set speechless.
The lights on Loose Women shone a little brighter that morning, as though the producers knew this episode would be different. The set had its usual warm, chatty energy, mugs on the table, audience laughter in the background, but the moment Sir Anthony Hopkins walked in, the tone shifted. There was a hush of respect, a sense of curiosity. The man carried decades of artistry, wisdom, and quiet authority. Denise Welch greeted him warmly at first, her trademark enthusiasm filling the room. "Sir Anthony, it's such an honor," she began, smiling. "You've played some of the most complex minds in cinema. I can't wait to hear what you think about this. Has political correctness gone too far, or is it just keeping us decent?" Anthony adjusted his glasses, his calm presence commanding the moment. "Decency is vital," he said softly, "but when it starts dictating what people can think or say, it stops being decency and becomes control." A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Denise chuckled lightly. "Well, I think control might be too strong a word. It's about compassion, about realizing words have weight." He smiled faintly. "Of course they do, but when fear replaces thought, art dies, and art, my dear, is what makes civilization breathe." The audience broke into polite applause, sensing the poetic rhythm in his words. Denise leaned forward, refusing to let the conversation settle. "But times have changed, haven't they? We've learned to listen to groups who were once ignored. That's progress." "Progress," Anthony replied, his tone still measured, "should not mean suppressing the messy parts of human expression. We learn by stumbling over words, not by silencing them." The studio air thickened. There was no shouting, no chaos, just two people standing their ground with intelligence and pride. Jane Moore tried to lighten the tension with a quick laugh. "I can see this one's going to get heated," she joked, sipping her tea. Denise smiled at that, but her eyes stayed locked on Hopkins. "So you don't believe some topics should be off-limits?" "Not in art, not in life. If something's forbidden to discuss, that's precisely what we must discuss. Silence never healed anyone." That line landed. A wave of quiet washed through the studio. Even the audience members who had been whispering fell still. Denise crossed her arms slightly, her voice gaining edge. "But there's a difference between free speech and giving people a platform to spread hate. Shouldn't we draw the line somewhere?" Hopkins nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, but we draw that line with conscience, not censorship. The problem is," he paused, his eyes narrowing just a touch, "people no longer trust each other's conscience." The reaction was instant. A few claps, a few gasps, a few uneasy laughs. Denise leaned back, almost challenging him. easy for someone in your position to say. You've got a voice the world listens to. Some of us have to deal with the consequences of speech that wounds." His reply came calm, steady, and devastating. And yet every time someone speaks with honesty, they risk being wounded too. A hush fell. Even the co-hosts exchanged glances, Ruth, Kay, and Nadia, watching closely, sensing something deeper brewing beneath the polite tone. Denise tried to keep the energy light again, her smile returning, though a little tighter. "I suppose we'll have to agree that you're a man who enjoys pushing boundaries." Anthony gave a slight smile. "And you're a woman who protects them. Perhaps that's why this conversation matters." The audience laughed and applauded, breaking the tension for a brief moment. But everyone in that room could feel it. The spark had caught. The polite conversation was over. Something bigger was coming. And as the camera zoomed in on Hopkins' face, his eyes glinting with quiet defiance, it was clear the real clash hadn't even begun.
By the time the second segment began, the energy inside the Loose Women's studio had shifted from polite intrigue to open tension. The audience leaned forward in their seats, sensing that the niceties were gone. The conversation had teeth now. Denise Welch crossed her legs, ready for round two. "Anthony," she began, her voice firm but calm, "I think you're romanticizing a world where people could say whatever they wanted without consequence. That freedom you're talking about? Well, it often came at someone else's expense." Anthony Hopkins listened carefully, hands clasped together on the table. "You mistake accountability for censorship, Denise. They're not the same thing." Denise raised an eyebrow. "Then tell me, where's the line? Because the moment someone says something hateful, people expect a response. Isn't that fair?" He nodded slightly. "Fairness, yes, but the mob isn't fairness. It's fury, disguised as virtue." That drew a murmur from the audience. Some clapped, others gasped. The tension was now electric. Denise pressed harder. "So you're saying people shouldn't react when someone says something cruel or bigoted?" "I'm saying people should react with reason, not rage," Hopkins replied. "We live in an age where everyone shouts and no one listens. That isn't progress. That's noise." The camera cut to the co-hosts, visibly uneasy but fascinated. Ruth tried to mediate. "Anthony, you've always spoken about the power of words in your craft, but don't you think artists also have a responsibility to the public mood?" "Responsibility, yes," Hopkins said, his voice low and resonant. "Obedience, no." That single line landed like a punch. The crowd broke into applause. Denise smiled tightly, eyes narrowing slightly, but she wasn't done. "It's easy for you to say that from a place of privilege," she shot back. "You're not the one who has to face hate speech online every day, or see people targeted for who they are." Hopkins turned to her fully now, his expression soft but serious. "Do you think I've lived untouched by cruelty?" he asked. "I grew up in a working-class town during hard times. I've seen what hate does. But I've also seen what happens when we let fear decide what can be said. It destroys creativity. It divides people." The audience quieted. His tone carried weight, not arrogance, but conviction earned through a lifetime of watching humanity's extremes. Denise wasn't backing down. "So what's your solution then? Let people say whatever they want and hope kindness wins out?" He sighed. "No, let people speak, and let truth sort itself from lies. It always does, if we let it." Denise shook her head, a hint of frustration slipping through. "That sounds beautiful, Anthony, but the real world isn't a movie. People get hurt while truth takes its sweet time." He leaned in slightly. "And people lose themselves when fear takes over. Tell me, Denise, are you afraid of words or of what they reveal about us?" That question hit the air like thunder. The audience gasped, audibly. Denise blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I'm not afraid," she replied, her tone sharpening. "I just think people need to be held accountable." "Accountability," Hopkins said quietly, "comes from understanding, not from punishment." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. The studio audience didn't move, didn't whisper. Even the producers in the control booth could be seen watching intently through the glass. Nadia tried to ease the tension. "I think you're both right in a way. We want freedom, but we also want compassion. Maybe the challenge is finding balance." Hopkins nodded politely, but his gaze stayed fixed on Denise. Balance, he said, is impossible when one side gets to decide what's acceptable. Denise's smile tightened. Or maybe balance is impossible when people refuse to adapt to a changing world. Their words now felt less like a discussion and more like a duel, each sentence deliberate, each pause loaded. Hopkins sat back, folding his hands. Change is fine, Denise, but when change demands silence, it's not growth, it's erasure. That line drew a wave of applause that lasted longer than expected. Some audience members even stood. Denise let out a small laugh, trying to break the tension. You really don't mince words, do you? I'm an old man, Hopkins said, half smiling. At this age, you learn truth is the only currency worth spending. The laughter that followed was uneasy, but respectful. It was the kind of humor that comes after a storm, not before it. As the segment wrapped for a commercial break, Denise and Hopkins exchanged a brief professional smile, but their eyes told the truth. This was far from over. The debate had only reached its midpoint, and the next round promised emotion, conviction, and perhaps a reckoning neither of them expected. When the cameras cut, the studio buzzed with whispers. Viewers knew they weren't just watching a conversation about political correctness. They were witnessing two generations wrestle with the meaning of freedom itself. When Loose Women returned from the break, the tone had changed. The laughter was gone. The chatter had softened into silence. The audience sensed something heavier in the air, like they were about to witness not a debate, but a reckoning. Anthony Hopkins sat still, his hands folded on the table, his gaze steady. Denise Welch looked just as composed, but her jaw was tight, her eyes locked on him. The tension between them wasn't hostile, it was ideological. Two people who truly believed what they were saying, unwilling to yield an inch. Jane Moore reopened the conversation carefully. Before the break, she said, we were talking about the difference between accountability and censorship. Anthony, you mentioned fear replacing thought. Could you explain what you meant by that? Hopkins took a breath, his voice calm but layered with emotion. Fear, he said, has become the great editor of our time. People no longer speak their truth. They speak what they think will keep them safe. Safe from outrage, safe from judgment, safe from being erased. The audience was silent. Every word carried weight. He went on, when I was a young man, I said foolish things. I made mistakes, but I learned. I grew. That's what humanity is, fallible, flawed, and capable of change. Now, we punish mistakes as if we've forgotten we all make them. Denise listened, her arms still crossed, but her jaw was tight, her eyes locked on him. The tension between them wasn't hostile, it was ideological. Two people who truly believed what they were saying, unwilling to yield an inch. Denise, when you talk about boundaries, you mean safety, he said, but boundaries often become walls. Walls behind which ideas die of loneliness. The audience was silent. With a usual Loose Women crowd, the room would normally be filled with their murmurs of agreement or disagreement. But today, every ear was tuned in. Denise came back with a sharper edge. You call it walls, I call it self-preservation. I've been on the receiving end of online abuse, and it goes beyond offense. It feels like violence. Hopkins nodded his head slowly. It's violence because it's mindless. Real free speech is thoughtful. It requires empathy, not just intent. The audience applauded gently, not for sides, but for the moment of honesty. Denise's shoulders lowered, her tone less combative. Maybe, she said, but in this new world, courage sometimes looks like restraint. Hopkins leaned back, thoughtful. I don't disagree, but restraint must be a choice, not a demand. When it's demanded, it stops being moral and becomes mechanical. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The camera cut between them, the contrast striking. His calm, aged wisdom against her passionate, contemporary realism. Both were right, in their own way. Then Anthony shifted, almost as if he decided something. He leaned forward, his hands open on the table. Let me tell you something, Denise. I grew up in Port Talbot, Wales. It was a hard, dirty town.
My father worked in the steel mill. His hands always smelled of iron. He wasn't educated, but he spoke his mind. He told me, if they take your voice, they'll take your soul next. I never forgot that. The audience was silent now. You could hear the hum of the lights. Hopkins' voice softened. I've seen people silenced by governments, by mobs, by fear. The result is always the same: emptiness. People afraid to create, afraid to question, afraid to live. Denise blinked slowly, absorbing his words. Her tone gentled. That's powerful, Anthony, but don't you think times have changed? We're more connected now. One person's words can reach millions instantly. Doesn't that mean we have more responsibility? Yes, Hopkins said, but responsibility is not submission. It's awareness. We should teach empathy, not censorship. The audience burst into applause. Even a few of the hosts joined in. Denise didn't clap, but she smiled faintly, almost acknowledging the strength of his conviction. I can agree with that, she said quietly, but sometimes empathy has to come first, before art, before freedom. Hopkins looked at her with something between sadness and admiration. Then it's no longer empathy, Denise. It's fear dressed as kindness. A collective gasp filled the room, not out of shock, but out of recognition. It was one of those lines that stuck. For the first time, Denise looked down at the table, her thoughts turning inward. When she finally looked back up, there was a hint of emotion in her eyes. You know, I lost a dear friend a few years ago because of something she said on television. She wasn't cruel, just clumsy. One wrong sentence, and her whole career was gone. That's what scares me. Not the speech, but the silence that follows. Hopkins' eyes softened. Then we agree, he said. Silence is the real danger. The audience applauded again, this time slower, more emotional. Jane Moore leaned in, sensing the shift. I think what we're hearing is that both of you value kindness and truth, you just see the path there differently. Hopkins nodded, offering a small smile. Perhaps truth and kindness are the same thing. It's just that truth comes first. Denise exhaled, her tone calm again. And kindness helps people hear it. The tension broke, not in triumph, but in understanding. It wasn't over yet, but for a moment there was connection. Two strong voices finding common ground, however fragile. The audience erupted into applause, the kind that carries warmth instead of noise. But as the camera zoomed out, there was something in Hopkins' expression. A flicker of frustration, maybe even sadness. Because deep down, he knew the next question would reignite everything. And when it did, neither would be able to walk it back.
The conversation picked up again after another short commercial break, but this time there was a new kind of intensity. The earlier tension had returned, sharper, more focused. The studio lights seemed brighter, the room quieter, the air heavier. Everyone knew they were nearing that edge where discussion becomes confrontation. Jane Moore's tone was cautious when she reopened. Before the break, we talked about empathy and truth, she said. But let's be honest, free speech doesn't live in the abstract. It plays out in headlines, tweets, and cancellations. Anthony, you've been criticized for speaking your mind before. Do you ever feel like you have to hold back now? Hopkins smiled faintly, but it wasn't a warm smile. Of course I do, he said. Everyone does. You can't walk through a modern conversation without stepping on eggshells. Every sentence is a potential crime scene. But if you censor yourself long enough, you stop thinking clearly. That's not progress. That's decay. Denise leaned forward, her tone sharper now. But Anthony, some of those eggshells are people's lives, their dignity, their safety. It's not about fragility, it's about respect. Hopkins looked at her, unblinking. Respect, he said slowly, is earned through honesty, not protection. I can't respect a society that tells people what they're allowed to feel or say. The audience reacted, some clapping, others murmuring.
Denise took that as her cue to push back harder. You're talking like free speech exists in a vacuum, but words influence behavior. When famous people talk carelessly, it gives permission for cruelty to follow. Hopkins' voice hardened. Then teach people to think, Denise. Don't muzzle everyone to protect a few. You can't fix cruelty by silencing courage. Denise shot back, her voice rising now. That's easy for you to say when you've never had to face the consequences of being on the wrong side of outrage. The room erupted in noise, half gasps, half applause. Hopkins' expression changed, something in him cracking slightly. "You think I haven't faced consequences," he said, his Welsh accent deepening with emotion. "I've lived through decades of being told who to be, what to say, what parts I was allowed to play. I didn't come from privilege. I fought for every inch." Denise tried to interject, but Hopkins raised his voice, not shouting, but with a quiet thunder that silenced the room. "I grew up poor and voiceless. My father was a laborer. My mother scrubbed floors. If I had believed I wasn't allowed to speak, I'd still be trapped in that silence. So when I see this generation, educated, connected, free, using their freedom to silence others, I call that a tragedy." The audience burst into applause, louder this time. Even Jane looked moved. But Denise wasn't backing down. She leaned closer, her tones softer but cutting. "Anthony, you're speaking from strength, from success, from safety. But what about those who aren't heard unless the rules change? For women, for minorities, for the people who've always been talked over, political correctness isn't oppression, it's oxygen." The applause shifted sides. The tension snapped tight again. Hopkins' gaze didn't waver. "If their voices matter, and they do, then we should amplify them, not create new cages for everyone else. You don't build equality by building walls." "Walls," she said incredulously. "You mean boundaries, basic decency." He shook his head slowly. "No, I mean fear disguised as virtue. The world doesn't need more boundaries. It needs thicker skin and open minds." The audience gasped again. Jane tried to mediate, but the energy between them had overtaken the room. It wasn't anger. It was conviction colliding with conviction. Denise's voice quivered slightly as she fired back. "You talk about thick skin, but some people don't have the luxury of pretending words don't cut. You've never been dismissed, mocked, or threatened just for being who you are." That landed hard. Hopkins paused. For the first time he seemed wounded, not by insult, but by misunderstanding. "I have," he said quietly, "not for who I am, but for what I believe, for daring to question, for being the wrong kind of artist in the wrong kind of time. Every generation has its forbidden voices. I simply refuse to be one of them." There was silence, deep, uncomfortable silence. Denise exhaled, her voice trembling with emotion. "So what? Everyone should just say whatever they want, no matter who it hurts?" His reply was immediate. "No, everyone should speak with conscience. But conscience isn't something the crowd decides for you. It's personal. That's what makes it sacred." The audience applauded again, but it was softer this time, more reverent than excited. Denise's eyes glistened. For a second, she looked like she might cry. She whispered, almost to herself, "Sometimes I wish I had that kind of freedom." Anthony's expression softened, but before he could respond, Colleen Nolan, sitting silently until now, spoke up. "But Anthony, don't you see how dangerous that sounds in a time where hate spreads like wildfire? If everyone speaks without filter, chaos follows." Hopkins turned toward her calmly. "Maybe," he said, "but I'd rather live in chaos with truth than in order built on silence." The audience erupted again, louder than ever before. It wasn't a cheer, it was a storm. People on their feet, some clapping, some shaking their heads.
Denise sat back, visibly overwhelmed. Hopkins looked down at the table, his jaw tight. Jane Moore finally cut in, her voice steady but urgent. All right, let's pause. I think we can all agree this conversation isn't about left or right, it's about fear and freedom. Two things that rarely coexist. Hopkins nodded slightly, still looking away. Denise wiped her eyes, breathing deeply. Fear and freedom, she repeated. That's exactly it. And right now, fear's winning. Only if we let it. The studio fell silent again, the air dense with meaning. Both had spoken their truths, neither had won. But something had shifted, something raw and honest that couldn't be undone. Jane glanced at the camera, her voice softening. All right, we'll be right back. The lights dimmed slightly, the theme music swelled, and as the applause rose, Anthony Hopkins leaned back in his chair, his expression distant, almost sorrowful. Denise exhaled shakily, her hand trembling on the table. Both of them knew this debate would live far beyond the broadcast. It had stopped being a conversation about political correctness. It had become a question of what freedom was worth and what silence was costing.
When the show returned from the break, the mood was noticeably different. The laughter and chatter that usually filled the Loose Women set were gone. The table was quieter, the lights felt softer, and even the audience seemed to sense that something profound had just taken place. Anthony Hopkins sat with his hands clasped, looking reflective rather than defensive. Denise Welch, across from him, had stopped fidgeting. Her earlier fire had cooled into something else, introspection, maybe even understanding. Jane Moore, ever the professional, spoke gently. Before we wrap, she said, I think what's happened here today deserves a moment of honesty. We started talking about political correctness, but we've ended up somewhere much deeper. Anthony? Denise? How do you both see it now? Hopkins took a breath before answering. I think, he said slowly, that we live in a time where everyone's terrified of being misunderstood, but misunderstanding is part of being human. If we lose the ability to forgive, to listen, to disagree, then conversation itself dies. And that's the death of something much bigger than free speech. That's the death of connection. The audience stayed silent, hanging on his words. Denise nodded slowly, her voice softer now. I don't disagree with that, she admitted. Maybe I got carried away earlier. I see so much pain online, people weaponizing their words, and it scares me. Sometimes it feels like empathy's disappearing. Hopkins gave her a faint, almost paternal smile. Empathy isn't gone, he said. It's just buried under fear. You can't force people to be kind by threatening them. You can only show kindness and hope it spreads. That line, hope it spreads, seemed to land in the audience's hearts. The camera panned across faces, some smiling, some tearful. It wasn't the fiery clash anymore. It was two people finding a fragile peace in their disagreement. Colleen Nolan leaned forward, breaking the quiet. It's strange, isn't it, she said. We call it free speech, but everyone's so scared to use it. Maybe what we need isn't fewer words, but better ones. Hopkins nodded. Yes, words with courage, words with compassion. Those are the only kind that matter. Denise smiled faintly, brushing away a tear. Maybe we just need to remember that conversation isn't combat, she said. It's not about winning, it's about understanding why the other person believes what they do. The audience applauded softly, not like before. This time it was more of a tribute than a reaction. Jane turned back toward Hopkins. You've always spoken your mind fearlessly. Do you ever worry about how people interpret it? Hopkins chuckled, the heaviness lifting slightly. Of course, I'm human. I get called all sorts of things, but I'd rather be misunderstood than muzzled. Life's too short to trade truth for comfort. Denise smiled gently.
even if that truth stings? Hopkins grinned, especially then. The studio erupted in laughter, a much-needed release of tension. Even Denise laughed, shaking her head. "Well," she said, "you certainly don't hold back, do you?" "No," Hopkins said with that signature glint in his eyes. "I'm too old to start pretending now." It broke the room open again, the air lighter, the energy warmer. What had started as a clash of generations and philosophies had turned into something else entirely. A moment of human connection across the divide. Jane Moore looked to camera 3. "What I love about days like this is that you see passion, disagreement, and still respect. Maybe that's the message for everyone watching. It's okay to argue, as long as you remember the person across from you isn't the enemy." Hopkins nodded thoughtfully. "That's the essence of it. We've turned debate into a battlefield, but it used to be an art form. It used to be about the exchange of ideas, not the destruction of people." Denise added softly, "Maybe we can bring that back." For a moment, the camera caught the two of them smiling at each other, not as adversaries, but as two voices on different sides of the same fragile truth. The audience rose in a standing ovation, not because anyone won, but because they'd just witnessed something rare on daytime TV. Two people actually listening. Jane moved, closed the show with warmth in her tone. "Well," she said, "if today's conversation taught us anything, it's that words matter, but how we use them matters even more. Thank you to Sir Anthony Hopkins, to Denise Welch, and to all of you watching at home. Keep talking, keep thinking, and above all, keep listening." The theme music swelled. Hopkins reached across the table and gently patted Denise's hand. She smiled, whispering, "Thank you for challenging me." He replied simply, "Thank you for caring enough to fight back." The cameras kept rolling for a few extra seconds as the audience clapped. Hopkins leaned back, thoughtful but content. Denise looked down, blinking back emotion. In that quiet, between the applause and the outro music, there was something unspoken but unmistakable. They hadn't solved the debate about political correctness, but they had reminded everyone watching that courage and empathy don't cancel each other out, they complete each other. And for a brief moment, the Loose Women stage didn't feel like a talk show. It felt like what the world was missing, a real, human conversation. If you liked this powerful exchange, make sure to subscribe for more emotional debates, heartfelt moments, and unforgettable TV clashes. Drop a comment below. Do you think free speech and compassion can truly coexist in today's world?